Fans of a Horus heresy, the Mechanicum of Mars, and subterranean super assault vehicles, thank you very much for joining me for a model and build review of the Mechanicum Ordinatus Aktaeus super heavy transport vehicle. And this is a full resin kit by Forge World. And here we have this mighty beast in front of us. So firstly, before I get into this review, I hope you're all well. It's been a while since I've made a video where we've had a little chat and discussion about something. So I do hope that you are all doing well, and it's good to speak to you again and share some thoughts on this wonderful model that I've just finished building. And I bought this back at release, which was February 2019 at the last Heresy Weekender, the last Horus Heresy Weekender. That was the one held at the Radisson Blu, that was it, the Radisson Blu Hotel at Castle Donington. So for those of you who remember that day, this is when I got this model. And what I'm going to do in today's video is I'm going to show you around the model, take a look at some of the details because there are many, and as you may expect for a large Forge World kit like this, it is spectacularly detailed in every regard. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about the build process, so in terms of how I found it, what I did, any modifications I applied, pros, cons and issues. We'll touch on some of those. And then finally I'll finish up with some size comparisons against some servants of the Omnisire, just to give you a feel for how large this vehicle is, and hint, it's huge. So a little bit about the model. So firstly, let's have a look around this beast. As we have the standard size 1 leaky cheese hands here, you are probably getting a feel already for this being a big model, and it is. This is one of what you might call the super heavy vehicles of the Heresy world. And certainly fits into the Lord of War category if you are gaming as well. The basic premise of this model is it is a land crawler with these 4 huge tracks, on top of which is mounted a subterranean. If you're wondering what a subterranean is actually the true name for an underground burrowing vehicle. As to whether or not anyone's built these, well, maybe one's, possibly one made in Soviet Russia, or certainly tested to some degree. But at the moment, aside from industrial applications, drilling tunnels, the actual concept of an underground tunneling vehicle is beyond perhaps not the capabilities of science, but certainly of engineering. But that is what we have here, and there's many wonderful little design touches in this model, as you may well expect by something from the sculptor. And this was sculpted by Stuart Williamson, who is a member of the now Specialist Design Studio. Then he was a part of Forge World and the Horus Heresy bit. But yeah, that's who designed this. And there's a number of nice little nods to vehicles and pop culture within this. And let's perhaps come back to that once I've shown you some of the details of the vehicle. We've got a central carriage with a carrier rail on which the Aktaeus is mounted. We then have the 4 large caterpillar trawlers which move the assembly through the world or across the land. There is an engine unit at the back and a power plant, and this is undoubtedly some sort of microfusion reactor, something to move this beast. A nice set of transmission detailing, some pipes. I rather like these little features here. And these are, I imagine these as being fluid top off, so perhaps coolant or fuel. And they, a bit like if you can imagine an umbilical on a rocket launch vehicle. So up until shortly before it launches, certainly for the liquid gas elements, so like oxygen, hydrogen, they need to keep the tanks topped off due to evaporation and other reasons. And I imagine these doing the same thing, keeping it fully fueled, ready up until the point at which it's launched. We've got this here, which is a launch rail, which holds the Aktaeus itself. Or perhaps at this point we can drop in a little reference here, because anyone who played the original Epic game, well, let's take a step back from Epic, Space Marine, there was a unit called the Imperial Mole, and this is pretty much a direct recreation of the Imperial Mole. I don't think it's a hellbore, but I think it's a mole, which was a middle-sized of the 3 vehicles. There was the Termite, which we now have as a small-sized Forge World drill, and its name has just escaped me there. We have the Aktaeus, or the Imperial Mole, and then finally there was the Hellbore, which was an absolutely colossal vehicle, more like a Battle Titan sized thing, so something a bit more like Warlord that's hiding in the background there. Yeah, we can see that there's lots of detailing all around it, perhaps a little cogitator brain there. We always like our Mechanicum cogitator brains. And then there is a pair of forward-mounted sponson fixed Volkite culverins for point defence. This lower section is not really the combat vehicle. This is here purely to launch the Aktaeus and its occupants. Let's have a quick look underneath, and then we will get into some of the more interesting features of this model. And as is often the case with Forge World, we have a fully detailed underside, which is a nice touch and shows that nothing's been skimped. I really like this transmission detailing here at the back, and you can imagine the enormously powerful gears that might be involved in making this thing move. Now I'm going to remove the Aktaeus from the launch rail. It is magnetised, so now we can see the launch rail as is. And this is nicely detailed. It's not exceptionally detailed. You've already probably noticed I put some magnets on. I drilled out some extra holes onto the umbilicals just because they were flat and I thought they needed a little bit of detail, so I put a couple of countersunk holes into that. Yeah, so nothing particularly exciting there, just functional detail, I'd say. We've got some nice features here on the upper deck of the drive or the reactor. Let's now move that into the side briefly to take a look at the actual Aktaeus itself. First up, we have to look at the beautifully detailed drilling head, and this is absolutely magnificent. And as you've already noticed, or noticing now, this rotates. And it's really nicely designed because not only does the whole thing rotate, but that can rotate, this can rotate, there we go, and even the tip, just the tip. And I'll come back to that because this is a designed feature of the kit, but it does require some additional modelling work to get it to go properly, I think anyway. Certainly if you want it to, like this, be wobble free and nice and tight. As we move along the side of the Aktaeus, we've got a set of missile racks, and there's 3 of these, one on the port side, starboard side, and then the dorsal side. And this is the Terrebrax missile battery. And what this is designed to do is when the vehicle emerges at its target point, it's no longer, it can't drive anymore. Once it pops out onto the surface, it can't drive. So it's not like the termite assault drill, which can zoom around the battlefield, causing all sorts of nonsense. This thing's like a beached whale. But it does have these that pop out and then discharge rockets to support its troops. Now, I did a very fiddly little magnetisation job to magnetise this post, so it does actually magnetise, popped out and popped in. That took quite a lot of figuring, but it works nicely. For painting reasons, the missile racks aren't attached yet, so it's a little bit difficult for me to actually show you these working as intended, but they do pop out like that. And it's rather nicely executed, I will say, in terms of a design. I'll just pull these through one at a time, see if we can get it into a deployed configuration. Just got to remove one final set. There we go, a little bit of a BFI. BFI equals brute force and ignorance, if you were wondering. There we go. And that's how the Terrebrax rocket battery is supposed to look in its deployed state. And we can imagine these missiles buzzing off and striking targets to suppress enemy units as the assault troops disembark. And talking about the assault troops disembarking, we've got some absolutely beautiful details that convey how that might happen. First, we have this large circular access door, and you can see the series of locks. And if you've ever seen a photo of how a submarine, so particularly I'm thinking a military submarine, an internal door works, or perhaps on, say, a battleship from the Dreadnought era, you might recognize some of the design cues that have been fed into this. So that's nice. And then also these even larger, and they're pretty big, but these even larger roller shutter doors, which will sort of concertina open. They're not articulated on the model, but I think we get the idea. And these details are repeated on both sides of the model. Now, if we think a little bit about how its mode of movement is reflected, obviously we've got the large drill head, then we've got these grabbing, rotating tracks that I believe will pull the Aktaeus through the earth. As the head grinds its way through the rock using the array of melter cutters, which you can see are dotted liberally around its circumference. both on the fore and midsection of the drill. And then finally, there's another bit that is the go-go bit, and we've got this fairly impressive looking engine. And I imagine this, as well as perhaps a forward pull of the head, the tracks, this engine will provide thrust as well. And again, beautiful detailing here. Thrust and, as well, imagine heat dissipation, because the whole operation of this thing is going to be very, very hot, isn't it? Heat management is going to be a big challenge. And it's nice to think that, you know, when you look at the radiators here and there, that the designer has thought about this and engineered some features into it, which, while we don't actually know how they work, are some thoughts around the reality of the vehicle's operation. So there is the Aktaeus itself, and this actually rests rather nicely on the gaming table. So if you were to play this game and say, bump, it's deployed there, it sits okay. You could easily build it a small base, just to sort of like some rubble to sit it in. That would also work quite nicely. And it works well in a game then. You've got your deployment points for your troops to come from, and also the missile batteries from which to draw LOS. I do like that. Now, let's look at its party piece. So as well as a head, the other thing it has is this rail is fully articulated and allows us to put the Aktaeus into its launch configuration. And so if I just move this, we can see it's moved from this point here, and then I raise it up. There is a piston here, which I'm going to snap into position, and then there's a cog and a set of magnets at the front, and now the ramp is in a launch deployment position, like so. So that's very, very nice how that works. I'm going to take that back down, like that, and then we're going to place the actual Aktaeus back on itself. And I have to be careful here, because although I only used 4 magnets, these are surprisingly strong, and the grip is actually excellent. So to actually do this with the vehicle on, I take it, I slide it forward, roll it up, lock that piston into position, locate the front, and there we go. Now, part of what I'll touch on when we get onto the construction is this took me quite a bit of engineering to figure it out. Well, engineering is probably too strong a word, but quite a bit of thinking about the forces and the way that it was going to sit and the way it was going to move to come up with a configuration that would be strong enough to hold it reliably. But we got there, and I will share how I did that with you. It does look absolutely magnificent. If we're considering Forge World as a place to buy amazing models that just nobody else ever touches doing well, I think the Aktaeus ticks the boxes absolutely spot on there. Another thing I just want to talk about before we get into the build is I just want to touch on a couple of design influences. If you are of my age, and maybe even younger, you will have already probably be furiously typing into the comments that this looks like the mole from Thunderbirds, and indeed it does. There are a lot of similarities. The launch configuration, the tracked unit, obviously, though here we've got double tracked bogies, come back to that, and these sideward mounting pullers. The drill section is a lot more squat, the Thunderbirds one. The mole was very long and thin. This is short and stubby, as was the original Imperial mole, and it also has the engine unit at the back. It's an obvious homage to Thunderbirds and the Thunderbirds mole, and I think that's a wonderful thing. As Picasso was famously said, good artists borrow, great artists steal, and that's an example of the latter here, I think. Another interesting bit on design influences are these tracked units. Now, these are quite different to the other Ordinatus model that Forge World produces, the Ordinatus Ulator or Ulator, which we might be looking at in a future video. They're quite a different design, and I think they convey a feeling of bearing immense weight. I don't think this is an accident either. I did a little bit of searching around after an idea popped into my head, and I'm pretty much confirmed that it's the case. I think the designer has taken the general configuration of NASA's super heavy rocket transporter, which I just can't quite remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll put a picture on screen now along with its actual name. And if we look at those track units, we can see that these ones are very in the style of, and I think that's a wonderful place to draw inspiration from for a vehicle which moves something immense and heavy. For me, there's 2 interesting design homages here. Well, 3 really. One is in universe to the Imperial mole. The second is pop culture, Thunderbird's mole. And the third is engineering, and that is to NASA's Super Heavy rocket transporter in these track units. And I think it's all being brought together seamlessly to create this incredible vehicle. Okay, so let's now talk about building this. And this is a bit where we have to face up to the reality of what we're working with here. So this is the full resin kit, and it's made by Forge World. It's in the Super Heavy class. It's comparable in kit size to, say, a Castus Knight, so the Asterius or the Porphyrion. It was also a similar type of kit size to the Mastodon transporter. So it's big. And like all large resin kits, it's difficult to build. And I think the vehicles are actually harder than the Titans, really. And this is no exception. This was quite a challenging build, I would say. It's not cheap either, but this is a niche in a niche, this model. And it's not for everyone. I can tell you that straight off the top. This is not for everyone. A lot of people will probably be put off by how it works in game, and they're wanting something that has very clear use in game. The current iteration of rules don't properly encapsulate the full vehicle in the way that the original set did in Horus Heresy 1.0. But I mean, for me, this is a centerpiece model, a fun build project, and also something I would occasionally use as a display piece in a game, or for those very special giant games. But yes, bearing all that in mind, this is not a model for everyone. It's a difficult build, and if you're going to buy one, be ready for some challenges. Right, let me try to talk you through what the many challenges were of this. First thing, this body section here comes in two parts, so that needed pinning together. I wouldn't dare trust this just to glue. We've got the 4 Caterpillar track units. The whole thing weighs 1.8 kilos, give or take a bit. I mean, mine's about 1.8 kilos. It's got some wire in it and a few magnets, so it's probably a little bit heavier than stock, but it's more or less there. In other words, there's a lot of weight just going on these resin axles. So what I've done on all 4 of the main axle units is I've run 2mm thick pins through these 3, and then a 1mm thick pin on this one at the back, all the way through as a strengthening axle. And now I'm going to tempt fate by pulling one of these off. There we go, like that. And you can see these axles. You can get super length 2mm drills to do these. You could use a different wire thickness. Personally though, I think you need 2mm. This is piano wire, by the way, so it's like mild steel wire. It's not a brass rod, which is too expensive for this and not hard enough. It hasn't got the right strength qualities. Interestingly, these units here, these articulate, and although the instructions don't show it to you, you could build these so they rotated independently, and you could actually then have the launch rail raised at an unusual angle on these. And I actually think this was a deliberate design on the part of Mr. Williamson. You could actually build it so the whole thing articulates up and down to sort of get it into different positions to launch. However, I wouldn't trust these without a heck of a lot of strengthening work to bear the weight of the model. And for me, it was just something I wasn't interested in doing for the amount of work and potential still to fail at the end of it. I wasn't particularly happy with how that would have worked, so I just built it this way. But it's an interesting thought there, particularly if you're perhaps thinking of this as a static display model and building it into a diorama, then that could be of interest to you. So pins. There's a big pin in this holding this transmission unit on. There's pins holding these pipes in. Each one of the umbilicals has a pin here. You see how it's got this V-shaped design. There's a pin in one side of each for strength, and then there's this very thin pin that holds this whole assembly here into the body. There's a pin in these cables, as you can see, that just jumped off. These have been left unglued just to help my painter friend when he comes to paint this, because it's going to be quite difficult to do that with those attached, so just leave them ready to attach. The launch rail, it comes with a separate section at the end, so I put 2 1mm pins in that for extra strength. This bit's going to end up bearing a lot of weight, so I'm glad I did that strengthening. I also did pins on the Volkite sponsons. If you didn't like the Volkite sponsons, you could easily leave them off and just put some detail over that to replace it if you weren't interested in them. And then you could use these on some other model. They're quite nice. Right, now we get onto one of the tricky bits, which is going to be tricky to show you. So this is the piston. Now I put a lot of pins into this because it's got to bear the weight of that, which is about 800-900 grams. It's a lot to go on this. If that was just resin and I left it displayed, that would bend. So I drilled a 2mm pin along with the length of that. Then offset in the base, I put a pin across it, and I did the same at the top, which is going to be hard to get in camera. At the top there's a T-piece that sits in here. So there's a pin that runs through that, offset against the long pin that runs the length of the piston. And the reason for all these pins is because there's a heck of a lot of weight potential on this, and particularly if you dropped it even just a little bit or grabbed it offline, there's going to be a lot of stress that gets exerted onto this, and it could easily break if just resin. So I put all those pins into it to strengthen it. Finally, there's two, this is a very nice design. There's two little attachment plates here. I'm going to struggle with the focus, I think, but we'll see how we go. Oh, maybe, yes. These two little plates here, those hold the top T-piece of this launch piston in place, and they're not particularly thick. So I put some 0.4mm wires, two thin 0.4mm wires for each one. So a very delicate bit of drilling, and I glued those in place to strengthen them and prevent them snapping easily. Because I could easily envisage a scenario where you pull on that a bit too hard, it just rips them out, and then it's bust. And because of how they're stuck in, you're never going to dig them out to repair them. So I did the work beforehand to strengthen that, and I think that a really important bit of strengthening that is. If you build this and you just say, well, I'm going to stick this in place and I don't want it to work, fine. You don't need to worry about that. Or any of the other bits of pinning I talked about around the piston. You don't need to bother about that. If you are going to articulate it though, I strongly recommend you put some strengthening on that. Okay, so now let's talk about the nose. I covered this in another video a bit. The way that this is set up is we've got the tip, and there's a spindle that runs through to here, and then there's a cap that mounts onto it and holds it in place. And then these sit on that axle and rotate. The axle has got a lot of slop in it. Yeah, now you can see mine does not have the slop. Mine is, it's well centered and it holds and it rotates. And the only reason that is because I built a series of plastic washers. So there's one there, one there, one there, one there. And I think there's another one somewhere. I think I ended up with 4 or 5, which are made to a tight fit on the central axle, super glued into the bulkheads on the appropriate locations, and then that just keeps it all centered and true. On the cap as well, make sure you glue that firmly. I forgot to do this. So you've got a cap, and it's a big old cap, it's about that big, and it goes onto the axle. It's a nice big attachment point, so I scored it all up. I was meaning to put a pin through it to skewer the axle in place on the cap, but I forgot. So I'm hoping it'll be strong enough. If it ever breaks, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to saw open the bottom here and do a repair job. Something to bear in mind there if you're building one. But if you want this to rotate, you're going to have to build some mechanism to hold it true, because out the box it won't do it. You'll get slop. And if you go into Forge World's Warhammer World store or the gallery, you look at the studio and the display versions, you can see how messy it looks without some washers to hold it true. I use plastic washers because it's a better material to interface with resin. Metal washers, as well as finding some of the right size, you would have the concern that over time, and if you're having a little mess around with it, they could wear, and then you start to get slop. That's not going to happen, or is very unlikely to happen with a plastic hard washer. And in terms of the thickness of a plastic hard, I used 1mm thickness. These magnets here, so there's a few magnets to get the launch assembly to work. So these, I think, were 6x3 N52 grade neodymium magnets. I only needed 2 at the front, 2 at the back, and the corresponding ones on the launch rail to get a really strong attachment. It's even strong enough to pick it by, although whatever you do, if you do magnetize this, don't try and do this. Don't try lift it by that, because then this can come up. I deliberately designed it not to be strong enough to lift by that. If these ever detach when you're holding it this way, this thing will just crash to the floor and it will do a lot of damage. The trade-off to that means that this isn't particularly strong and I can damage that, so I've got to be careful. And this is kind of moving beyond a bit perhaps what the kit was designed to do, so you just got to think about these things. There's like a set of magnets here. Those are 3x2 N52s, which have corresponding magnets here, and that holds the launch rail in place. There are a set of magnets which are going to be very hard to show. I think there's 3 that I put in the base of the launch piston here. So in the base of a T, there's 3 in that, and then 3 in the bottom, which I just forget the size, but they're as big as I could get to hold this in place, and it needs all that strength and those to hold it there. There's 2 magnets here and here, which correspond to those there, and launch rail magnets to hold it all together. when this is flat, and it gives it enough strength to hold it in place without creating that false sense of security I talked about earlier. So overall, what do I think on the build? It is a difficult kit. It's a large forge walled model. It's a resin model. It doesn't matter that it's forge or any resin kit this size, you're going to have a load of janky issues to deal with. I talked in a previous video about making sure you get this the right way up. I'll just touch on it again. This is not symmetrical, although it looks it. On the underside, there's these little panels which are a continuation of a launch rail. On the upper side, they're not there. There's nothing to get you to orientate this correctly, so be aware of that when you're building it. Also, make sure you get these things the right way around, because there are a front pair with the volkite covering mountains. It is a hard build. It's a rewarding model when you've done it, but I would strongly recommend this to experienced modelers. And ideally, if you've built at least one or two large forge walled resin kits before, particularly vehicles, that experience will set you up well for this. But still prepared to be challenged by this, because it is going to be difficult, especially if you want to make all this work like I've done. I like to think I've built this in a way that demonstrates the capabilities of this kit. Be under no illusion, getting there is a challenge. There's a lot to do. Let's now move on and quickly do some size comparisons. So I've got a few Mechanicum models here. I'm going to start with this guy, the humble tech thrall armed with a laserlock. These are part of my Mechanicum army. This was an army that was originally made by a guy I know called Crazy Doug, and he is a very talented painter, as you can probably understand. And he sold this army a few years back, and I bought it off him, and absolutely delighted with it. And it's nice to be able to showcase these models against the Aktaeus, and wow, you can see it's a monster. And if you're playing in game, this has got a transport capacity of 42 infantry models, so you can get 42 tech thralls in it. I don't know if you'll put 42 tech thralls in it. There are better things you can put in this, but it's big. Talking about getting bigger, let's now move to a Myrmidon, and this is a Myrmidon Destructor, looking particularly handsome and destructive. Love Doug's painting here. The white robes against the red was an inspired choice. Works so well. I mean, the Myrmidons are huge, and the Aktaeus dwarfs them. So you could fit 20 of those guys in. Now that's a more worthy payload. I think they're bulky as opposed to very bulky. 20 tech priests inside this will be a suitable welcoming committee or surprise committee in the middle of your opponent's fort. Luckily for us as well, the Aktaeus can also transport the ever fantastic looking Castellax. I just forget how many of these take up. Is it 10 spaces already? I just forget now. So you could get a good few Castellax inside this as well. And even the Castellax isn't looking particularly big next to it. I think we're going to have to move in terms of the Mechanicum to something really quite hefty in the form of the Thanatar Siege Automata or Autonomer to get a good comparison. And finally there, with the Thanatar, I think we've got something that is at least matching the height of the Aktaeus, if not anywhere near its bulk. And there you go, size comparisons. It's huge. It's absolutely massive. And what a brilliant centerpiece model or display piece for your army. I think that's where it really shines. So I think that's all I wanted to say on this wonderful kit. I think we'll just pop it in its launch configuration. So in summary, what are my thoughts on the Mechanicum Ordinatus Aktaeus? I think it's a model like no other that anyone released as a comparable kit. It is in a league of one, and I think it's wonderful that this thing ever got made, and I'm so glad I bought one because I'm absolutely thrilled with the end result. There are some pros and cons to that. The big pro is it's an interesting and challenging build, so you can develop your skills. It's going to push you, but you can also do a lot with the model, and it rewards that investment in time and skills. So that's something to be considered. Don't buy it thinking it's easy to build, because it won't be, and you could go horribly wrong. But if you want a model that's going to develop your skills further, this is a great consideration. It looks amazing. The design, I have no fault with the design. I love how it looks, how it works. It's just fantastic. What a brilliant bit of imagination this is. Cons, obviously, you've got the price. These are not cheap at all. Very carefully consider the price against the difficulty of the build as well. You can buy a caster's knight for the same sort of money as this, and that's a much more forgiving model to work on if you're looking to get into a large Forge World kit. So something to consider there. Other cons, it definitely has an in-game use as a transport, although it's a shame that the current rules for Age of Darkness, so Heresy 2.0, don't properly have the rules for the transporter in the way that the 1.0 rules did. And I think that's an oversight, and it sort of fits with the general slightly unfinished quality of Liber Mechanicum, which was clearly not finished to the same standard as Liber Astartes and Liber Hereticus. So that's a con to consider as well. But I think overall, that's what I'd say. So there you have it. The Mechanicum Ordinatus Aktaeus. A truly magnificent model in the best traditions of Forge World's crazy kits. Another thing I could describe this as being, to use a phrase that a friend of mine, Daz on Twitter, came up with, is this is an accent model. It's something that complements your army without necessarily being about an in-game performance unit. And on that observation, I think I'll leave it. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it interesting and insightful. Please do share your thoughts and observations in the comments. I'm always interested to hear those. But other than that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.